Good evening, all. I'm Kelly Strickland. I'm the Executive and Artistic Director of the Widener Center for the Performing Arts, and we are really happy you're with us tonight. This event is sponsored by the Tommy Thompson Center, and they have asked that I share a few remarks on their behalf. The Thompson Center is delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and partner with the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Thank you to the Widener staff and faculty members from the Department of Theater and Dance, Alan Kopishke and Tom Campbell, for their work to execute this event, as well as the Thompson Center staff, Alex, Ruth, and Lily. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. They work to further these goals by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, honoring exemplary public leaders with the Distinguished Public Leadership Award, and conducting other activities across all UW campuses. All the events are free and open to the public. For more information on their upcoming events, grant opportunities, or other aspects of the center, please visit the Thompson Center website. And now I'd like to invite to the stage Alan Kopishke to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks so much, Kelly, to you and to the entire incredible staff here at the Widener. I also want to thank Dr. Dawn Krim and the Advancement Department for all the work they did in helping us put all this together. I think Oskar's bio is out there in the material, so I just want to tell you why I wanted Oskar Eustis to come here. I think he is the most important theatrical producer we have. Through his years at the Eureka Theater in San Francisco as artistic director, as the associate artistic director of the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, artistic director of Trinity Rep in Providence, Rhode Island, and his long tenure as artistic director of the Public Theater in New York, he has helped nurture and develop some of the most important cultural milestones we have. Angels in America, Fun Home, Hamilton, and many, many more. He is not only a phenomenal theatrical producer, he is a phenomenal thinker. He is provocative and engaging and inspiring. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Oskar Eustis.
That was embarrassing. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ellen. Ellen has also known my wife since they were both teenagers, and I'm going to happily report how much you embarrassed me tonight. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'll stop. The basic thing I want to talk about is the fact that the internet is killing us, and that we require theater. Oh, that's right. I've got 2 minutes. Anything I need to do about that? You'll take care of it. The theater is what we require to survive. And it's sounding a little hyperbolic, but I actually mean it. We're still suffering from the trauma of the last 5 years, the COVID epidemic and everything that came out of this. And the tools that allowed us to survive during the epidemic have actually caused, I think, tremendous damage to our body politic and to our way of relating to each other that we haven't diagnosed or understood as a society. So let me go back a little bit to what I think the theater does, what I think the theater can do, and what I think the theater needs to do, what those of us who make it need to focus on in these years to come. And the first thing is that Arthur Miller said that tragedy, and really we can say that this is drama, is a machine for bringing a person directly into the path of the consequences of their own actions. That what drama really does is force a character to directly experience the consequences of what they've done. And that's what happens in great drama. By doing so, it reveals not only who the character is, but it reveals the cause and effect of what we do. And one of the reasons, you'll find in Los Angeles, they talk a lot about a likable character. One of our greatest plays, the Scottish play, involves a character that most of us wouldn't think was that likable. Because liking in the theater doesn't have to do with approving. It's not a superego relationship. It's an id relationship. We may not like the Scottish king, but we understand him. We understand the temptation to just break a rule to get what we want, to just do something bad, maybe just once, in order to be king. And we're fascinated when there's somebody who's actually willing to do it. And then not only do it, but continually report back to us on the state of his soul after he does it. So he essentially describes to us over the course of that play what happens to a person who decides to throw away his moral code in order to pursue his own ambitions. And what we find out is pretty horrifying. So, boy, theater superstition is hard. I'm going to do it though. Macbeth teaches us, we learn from watching that, the consequences of doing that action. And we believe it because Shakespeare's insight into what happens to somebody who ignores morality in favor of their ambition, what happens to them, to their soul. But now we are living in a world that is incredibly skillful at allowing people to evade the consequences of their actions. And in terms of human interactions, what better medium is there than social media to avoid the consequences of what you say and do? You can say anything on social media and be confident that you will never have to actually deal with the person that you're harming. What you throw out in the world does not come back to you. And indeed, the way the social media is structured right now, you live inside a siloed bubble where all you're going to hear is the positive feedback for the most hateful things that you can throw out into the world because you lob them over the net into some unseen other side where whatever human damage happens over there is invisible to you. And that isolation, which got so much stronger during our lockdowns in COVID, where we got so used to sitting behind our screens as a way of communicating to each other, has done something terrible to our spirit, has increased all of these tendencies were already there. But for people as old as I am, and I see at least one or two of you in the audience, the change in the tenor of our discourse is just shocking. It's hard to believe that this is the same country I grew up in. And the key characteristic of that is the utter lack of respect or regard for the consequences of what people are saying and doing, because they're not forced to face those consequences. In the theater, you have to. And I don't just mean that you have to inside a play. You have to when you're making a piece of theater. You have to when you're watching a piece of theater. And why is that? Yes, drama is storytelling. We know that, right? That's the sort of essential thing about storytelling. But it's separate from narrative. It's not just telling a story, because telling a story, narrative, there's many ways of doing that that are not drama, that are not theater. I could tell you a story right now. In a way, I am telling you a story right now. And our relationship is fairly straightforward. I'm up on stage, the light's on me, I'm talking to you, you're leaning back, you're thinking about whether you agree with me or disagree with me, but I'm the one with the authority. But in drama, I have to turn and talk to somebody else on stage. And that other person, if it's going to be a drama, can't agree with me. That other person disagrees with me. So already, truth is disputed. Drama, at its very essence, at the very beginning, is saying nobody owns the truth. Truth only comes about in the conflict between different points of view. And drama isn't about storytelling in the sense of, it's not about exposition. You don't go to a drama to hear the facts. I mean, let's take an example, Oedipus. You know, if you go into a production of Oedipus, I'm pretty sure you know what happens. I'm pretty sure your dad knows what happens. Your granddad knew what happens. When the audience went into the theater of Dionysius, when Sophocles first wrote the play, they all knew what happened. They weren't going to find out what happened. They were going to watch how the characters dealt with what happened. They were going to watch how Oedipus would go through the process of discovering the truth and what he would do about it. And then you read the play itself, and actually, everybody in the play figures out what happened. The play is full of everybody going, oh, Oedipus, you don't want to pursue this any further. It's going to be bad. You're going to find. And he says, no, I will. And they proceed further. By the time we get to, the last 20% of the play, everybody on stage has figured it out. Everybody on stage knows what the end of the story is. And his mother/wife, Jocasta, runs off stage to kill herself. There's no mystery anymore. But why does Oedipus keep going? Why are we still watching? Not because we're trying to figure out what happened. We want to know if Oedipus is going to fulfill his promise to pursue this to the end, to uncover the murder of Laius. And we're watching him. Because remember, he's the head of the government here. And we all know what any head of our government would do in this situation. He would appoint a commission to study the problem. And he'd give them a deadline that 5 years from now, they should come back with a report and present it to another. He would figure out some way to evade it. But what Oedipus does is pursue it to the end. And he asks that final question, and who was that boy? And the shepherd says, you. And he knew that was going to be the answer. But by pursuing to the end, he is showing he is willing to accept the consequences of his pledge to pursue the truth. And the entire energy of the play comes back and destroys him. He tears his eyes out. His life is destroyed. That's what Aristotle means when he says that characters in drama are better than we are. He doesn't mean they're nobility. Who cares if they're nobility? What he means is they're more willing to accept the consequences of their actions than we are. And therefore, they are exemplary. Therefore, we learn from them. Just as a corollary, he says characters in comedy are less willing. They're worse than we are. He means they're less willing to accept the consequences of their actions. And you can see it's the comic trope of somebody going to hysterical lengths to avoid being discovered out, being found out for what he's done. Again, that's what he means by better or worse. Yeah, it's got nothing to do with class. It's got nothing to do with riches. So, in my opinion. But that means that the knowledge that we're getting from the theater is knowledge of human beings and their actions and the consequences of their actions and what makes up a moral universe. This is knowledge that can only come about through human interaction. It can only come about through face-to-face interaction with other human beings. And it's why those of us who make theater love the rehearsal room so much. Because we know when the rehearsal room works, when you've got a rehearsal room that's actually functioning, all of us become better than we are outside the rehearsal room. Our own grievances and neuroses sort of start to fall away. And working with other people, trying to create something that's bigger than ourselves, brings out the best in us. And the rehearsal room tells us what we know is true, that we are at our best when we are working with other people. We are at our best when we are in community. We are at our best when we are solving problems together. This is not what our experience is when we're sitting alone in front of our screens, communicating through social media. And this coarsening of our national spirit is totally something that is anti-theatrical in the deepest sense of the word. Drama is the democratic training ground. It's why it was invented literally at the same moment as democracy. In the last 2 decades of the 6th century before the Common Era, in this little town on the Mediterranean, Athens, democracy and drama were invented at the same moment. Which came first, chicken and the egg, doesn't matter. What matters is the reason they both sprang to life at the same time is that drama and experiencing drama was the training ground for democratic citizenship. Everybody, every citizen of Athens was required to go to the Festival of Dionysus. This was not a voluntary activity. By the way, nobody had to buy a ticket. It was your right as a citizen. It was actually your obligation as a citizen to go there. Why? Because that was where you learned what it meant to be a citizen of a democracy. That plays with training and empathy. You had to learn how to see things from somebody else's point of view. You had to learn that the truth wasn't any one person's profession. When you believe truth is one person's idea, one person's possession, then you get a monarchy. But if you're going to have a democracy, you have to believe that the truth comes from the interaction of different people's points of view. And you have to ultimately believe that change is a good thing and that change will come from the interaction of different points of view. So the theater, watching the theater is training in this. Making theater is training in this. It is the democratic art form. And when we unleash its power, when we make it available for the society to see, when we make it available for people to participate in, we are strengthening the bonds of collectivity that make us a people. Another way of thinking of a play is that it's a machine for turning an audience into a community. Because we all know that the audience is also an essential part of being in the theater. That when you come in, you're a person. You bought a ticket, you got a voucher, who knows how, but you're just a person who decided to go to an event. But if the play works, you don't stay an individual person. You become part of a community that's the audience. And you've experienced it, you know this, is that if the play works, you're not just laughing. Everybody's laughing at the same time. And you get to the moving moment, and you're not by yourself having a tear trickle down your cheek. You're hearing sniffles, maybe even sobs, all across the audience. And when you reach the climactic moment of suspense, when you're wondering what's going to happen next, suddenly everybody's colds just clear up, and there's no coughing in the audience. Have you noticed that? When the play is working, it's why we all hate it up here when we hear people coughing, because we know it's not about them having a cold. It's that their attention isn't grabbed sufficiently. Because when we grab your attention sufficiently, you don't cough. And isn't that a magic moment when you're sitting in the audience and everybody is holding their breath, waiting to see what the character's decision is going to be, what they're going to do next. And you may not know it, but you've come to the theater not just to see the play. You've come to the theater to be part of an audience. It's why when you show up at the theater and there's only 10 other people scattered through this 2,000-seat auditorium, your heart sinks. And it's not just because you're wondering what everybody else heard about the play and why they're not here. It's also because you came here to be part of an audience. Because that doesn't happen when you go to a movie theater and the movie theater's empty. You love that. There's plenty of room to spread out. Nobody to disturb you. You put your popcorn on the seat next to you. You put your coat on the seat in front of you. It's great. It's just you and the movie. You don't want an audience with you. But the theater, you want that audience because that's the experience of communality that we crave as people. We need these things. We need these things to start building back our sense of being a community larger than ourselves. And let me just ask, what is left in this society? Where else do you get a group of people together to go through experiences that can be emotional, deep, intellectual, controversial, where everybody doesn't have to agree before they come in? At a church, everybody signed up to the catechism before they show up. At political conventions, everybody agrees who they're going to vote for before they show up. At the rallies. But at the theater, you can get people who hold completely different views showing up and going through a common experience. I'm going to use an example that we did recently at the Public. We did a play called The Ally this spring, which was a play about an American Jewish novelist who is in residency at a Northeastern university who signs a Black Lives Matter petition without fully reading the paragraph about Palestine. And all hell breaks loose. And the play is characterized by a lot of very fierce debates from different sides of these issues, Black Lives Matter, Israel, Palestine, by very articulate people. The first act ends with a Hillel student making a 3-page speech. It is a brilliant speech about why being anti-Israel is always and everywhere anti-Semitism and can never be construed as otherwise. And the speech is incredibly convincing. And then you hit the intermission. In the second act, a Palestinian makes a speech, a Palestinian student, of similar length about why the establishment of the State of Israel from 1947 on was an act of settler colonialism, and it lacks legitimacy from the very beginning. That is, again, brilliant, moving, powerful. After October 7th last year, there was an enormous amount of pressure on the theater for us not to do this play. And I mean enormous, from all sides. Because the play actually doesn't take a specific political stance. The play has an agonized Jewish novelist at the center of it, who by the end of the play still hasn't decided what he thinks. But that's because he's a stand-in for an awful lot of my audience who didn't know what they thought. The people, other people in the play, had very strong opinions about what they thought and expressed them powerfully. After a lot of tension, a lot of dissension, a lot of great, great difficulty, it was agreed that the play could go on. And for about 3 months, we had a room that I know was unique in New York City, and I suspect was unique in the country, where every evening, 300 people gathered who disagreed with each other very much politically, and I can promise that because they had vocal reactions that proved it, listening to arguments that they completely disagreed with all the way to the end, and having their arguments made all the way to the end. And during the entire run, there were lots of people shouting from the audience at various points. Nobody walked out of the play. No one. And nobody tried to stop the play. And every ticket flew out of the box office. I could have run that play for a year if the actors didn't have other commitments. And there was no other room in New York where that was happening. The event of the play was people simply listening to the other side all the way through, and there being no physical violence. And the contention, our contention from the theater was, that is what has to happen. We are modeling what needs to, and if that doesn't happen, there is no alternative but violence. This doesn't mean we have the answer to anything, but it does mean that this act of talking and listening is fundamentally the thing that's different from violence. And a student asked me about this a little bit earlier today. That's the thing that the theater pledges. The theater pledges, in its essence, that it is where you can listen to things that you don't agree with and nobody will be hurt. The theater is, in its bones, opposed to the idea that there should be voices or opinions canceled. Voices and opinions of integrity, that are real beliefs, need to be listened to, need to be understood. It's our only hope of being able to live together and of being able to build a society together. When we did Angels in America many years ago, it was an astonishing thing to do because we found ourselves with a play that was actually quite unplanned by us at the cutting moment of a huge change about what it meant to be gay in America. And we hadn't planned that. We were just working on a play about the AIDS crisis. And the we happened to be Tony Kushner, who turned out to be a genius. And he was just a really talented playwright that I was working with. And working on the play was extraordinarily exciting, difficult, fun, took 6 years. And when we first showed a little bit of it to some people, I was in San Francisco at the time, to some leaders of the gay community, the first 2 acts of Millennium, for those of you who know, the events center on a gay man who abandons his lover who is dying of AIDS. We got this wave of negative reaction back from the gay leaders. And the reason was that not only was that not demographically accurate about what was happening in the gay community, nobody had ever heard of that happening. That the true story of what was happening in the gay community was one of heroism and self-sacrifice, that all over gay men were coming together and supporting each other, loving each other. The abandonment was all by the birth families. That was the true story. And how could Tony tell this story that was so inaccurate about what was happening in the gay community? And again, I would have folded like a leaf if I'd been writing it. It was terrifying. But Tony, smarter than I, as he always has been, explained that this is not what the theater is for. The theater is not there to do advertisements for how good people are, or to do demographic analyses that make positive cases. The theater is there because it'll follow through on impulses that none of us follow through on. And what he wanted to write about was actually not the demographic analysis of the gay community. He wanted to write about Ronald Reagan's notion of freedom, because we were in Reagan's America. And he wanted to take a character who decides that he's going to save himself at all costs. He is going to be free of his responsibility to anybody else. And in order to do that, he had to write a character who did something terrible. And none of us may have done that, but all of us knows what it feels like to want to do that. To go, you know what? That's not my conflict. I can walk away from it. I'm not the one being oppressed in this circumstance. You know what? I don't need to be involved in that. I can just separate myself from that. I'm not at war over there, so I can just not be involved. We all know that feeling of just going, not in my backyard. It's not about me. And the play's power, which ultimately was, of course, dramatically embraced by the gay community, is the power of watching what happens to a character when he does that. And of course, eventually, he comes back. And that play went out in the world. And again, as I was explaining a little bit earlier to the students, I ran a theater a few years later in Rhode Island where I put on Angels in America. And Rhode Island, despite being very blue, it was also the most Catholic state in the Union. And I knew everybody in Rhode Island because it's Rhode Island, right? And, many of the audience I knew were homophobic. They told me so. And yet I would stand at the back of the theater and watch them leap to their feet with standing ovations at the end of the show. And, you're a homophobe, you're a homophobe. What are you doing standing on your feet? I wouldn't actually ask them that. I was far too happy to get a standing ovation. Who cares? But what I realized then, as I've realized a number of other points in my career, that of course the theater doesn't work in the realm of changing people's ideology. It doesn't make you go, wow, I have changed my mind. I now have a different ideology. I believe different things about the world. It works on the level of the heart and the spirit. And what had happened to those people is they had spent 6.5 hours identifying with and caring about openly gay characters. And they were leaping to their feet because they cared about Prior Walter and Louis Ironson, and they had loved going through that story and seeing them triumph at the end. That's what they were clapping for, not ideology. But they had now leapt to their feet and applauded for gay characters. They had identified with gay characters. And that worm of cognitive dissonance, that's what changes people's minds. Not arguments, but who you identify with, what the heart is. And that's the thing that we can do in the theater. And that's the thing that we now are called on to do. We have to do. We have to do within our country. And what I say within our field right now is that we are in terrible difficulty within the field. There are financial difficulties. There are legitimacy difficulties. Theaters are closing all over the country. And as I said earlier, I don't care what they tell you. We're in show business, and we're supposed to tell you everything's great. They're lying. Things are not great. 75% of the theaters that we've petitioned have audiences lower than they had in 2019. 85% have contributions lower than 2019. There have been 30 to 40 theaters have closed in the last 2 years, and there are many more on their way, and there are many more that are very, very shaky. We're not doing great. But now what we have to do is, in order for us to do great, we have to prove that we can do what I'm saying we can do, that we can be of use to our society, to our culture, that we can go out and help build communities, that we can be part of fighting the loneliness epidemic, that we can be part of bridging the divide that seems, doesn't it seem sometimes irreparable in this country? You're looking, how is that ever going to be healed? Well, it can be, but it needs the tools of telling stories, making drama together, witnessing drama together, finding things that bind us together. And I know this can work. We've seen this happen when Hamilton opened. Hamilton opened, and again, we knew we had a pretty good show. You know, it was an unlikely subject, that rap story of the first Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, people were not lining up to invest based on that log line. But immediately, it just captured the imagination of everyone who saw it. Why was that? It was because that was a moment, I think, it was because that was a moment where so many people were longing to feel patriotic again. There was so much about this country that disturbed them, and they were longing to be reminded of what was wonderful about America. And choosing to tell the story of the founding of America through the bodies and voices of immigrants to this country, people who were brought here involuntarily or voluntarily, who came here, and let them claim ownership of this story, and by claiming ownership of this story, claiming ownership of the country itself, was just this breath of fresh air that went through the theater. And it made an enormous impact because you could see it unleashed the latent optimism of the Obama years. I could use many other examples, but I'm actually coming close to the end of my time, and I'm just going to take a second to check, because there was one story that I promised to tell here, and I am going to tell it. I'm going to say one other thing first. That I've talked about using the tools of theater to let people see theater, and in everything from free Shakespeare in the Park to our mobile unit that goes around the 5 boroughs, to our national mobile unit, which we took around the upper Midwest, including Wisconsin, I hope we'll be able to revive in this new time. We do a lot of stuff for free. We do a lot of stuff trying to create access for people who haven't had access before. It's terribly important to do that. But it's terribly important not only to show theater to people, but to give people a chance to participate in it. We have a program called the Public Works Program, where we work with community-based organizations around the 5 boroughs. And we teach classes, and we do potlucks, and we bring people into the theater. And every summer we do this massive pageant where we audition and we cast 200 members from the community who aren't professionals. And we put on a gigantic Shakespearean musical with 5 of the best actors in the city of New York, Tony Award winners, 5 professional musicians, and 200 amateurs, most of whom have never been on stage before. And they include people from Domestic Workers United, which is the union of nannies and house cleaners, to the Fortune Society, which is an organization devoted to try to reintegrate formerly incarcerated people back into society, to the Children's Aid Society, all of these organizations that work with some of the most disadvantaged people in our city. And they all together are on stage, telling these stories together, standing on stage in the same spot where Meryl Streep and Al Pacino stand, and saying Shakespeare as if he belongs to them. And the effect is extraordinary, not only on them, but on the audience that watches them, because this is not just social work. This is the most exciting art that I watch every year, because it is extraordinarily excellent in its way. It's a different criteria from what we apply to fully professional productions, but it is just as demanding that there be the joy and the presence and the life of the theater. And those people, when they talk about what it's meant to them, 2 years ago, Fortune Society celebrated Public Works at their gala. And I got to watch 10 people who had been part of Public Works for 10 years get up and testify about how Public Works and AA were the things that had kept them out of jail for the last 10 years. And we were all a mess by the end of it because it was so clearly true that participation in the theater was an anchor of their lives that had nothing to do with making money. It had to do with being part of a community. We've got to figure out how to make that experience part of what we offer. And so we're talking about removing the professional from our mission statement. Making professional theater is part of what we do, but I don't think it needs to be all of what we do. I think it's a distinction and a silo that has outlived its usefulness. We need to be taking the tools of theater and using it to unleash the democratic and community-building potential of our country. That's what democracy is. That's a good ending, but I did promise to tell this story. When Samantha Power was our ambassador to the United Nations, she's a friend of the theaters, and she used to bring members of the Security Council to see our shows sometimes. It's kind of a team-building exercise, and other ambassadors of the UN. So she brought all of the Security Council to see Fun Home without telling them what it was about. And for those of you who don't know, Fun Home is a lesbian musical. And at the time she brought the Security Council, 3/4 of the members of the Security Council were from countries where homosexuality was illegal, including, of course, Russia, which is a permanent member of the Security Council. And they all saw the show. And, there were lively discussion afterwards, but, people enjoyed the show. By complete chance, 4 days later was the Orlando nightclub shooting. And 2 days after that, for the first and only time in its history, the United Nations Security Council released a statement condemning violence against the LGBTQ+ community. They have never done that before or since. And Samantha swears that it was only possible because they had seen Fun Home, that their hearts had been opened, their minds, their ideology had been softened. The theater can and does change people, from the most hardened political opinions to just teaching people that they can show up on time. It's a very powerful thing. Get out from behind your computers, get off of social media, make something with somebody else. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thanks.
Especially for that last story. It's really inspiring and moving, and for your speaking about the Public Works program, getting the theater out into the community, I think is so important. I am so pleased to welcome to the stage our panel, theater experts from across the state and the region, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, respond to your talk, and then inject something new into the conversation. And I'd like to start with our former Lieutenant Governor, Barbara Lawton.
Good evening. Barbara Lawton, former Lieutenant Governor, and perhaps the most exciting role that I played was Chair of the Wisconsin Arts Board for my full 2 terms, plus 2 years, because I had the chance to work with George, whom you will meet, and because we had a vision for the arts and culture and education growing and knowing that it was essential to the growth of good communities and of our commerce, et cetera. And so we really tore it up. It was a lot of fun. So we are really thinking along the same path tonight. when I thought about and watched and everybody should your TED Talk, which was a few years ago, so this was a post-reflection, but thought about it and thought about the line of theater and democracy that coming through our country to now, of course, goes through the Great Depression and the investment of the New Deal in jobs that included jobs in the theater. I don't remember how many thousands and thousands, and millions of people got to go to the theater because of that. And then there was McCarthyism, because new ideas are really scary. And so there was a move to close that down. I saw a movie in the last year that is absolutely delightful, and I hope you'll choose to see it too, called The Monk and the Gun by Pao Choining-Bhutan. And it's about a true story about the king of Bhutan in this century, in the 21st century, deciding to bring his country along and step back from his role and to have them become a democracy. And the way that they learn to become a democracy is through theater, and they play act at it, and they hold a mock election. And what you see when they're learning democracy through theater is that they're really rehearsing their future. But it's also a satire of our democracy. And so they would say, okay, there'll be yellow and there will be green, and you will yell at them and divide, and you can't be friends, and all of that. It was a moment that captured where we are now. So I'm where you are in understanding that theater is magnificent, but it has to engage everybody. I believe theater education, if we are serious about it and look at how essential it is to a democratic society, that it would replace civic education and engage everyone. And we would learn like they do in Africa right now, all across Africa. There is street theater that has been used to try to get children to have something to do besides become a soldier in the Civil War where they live, or street theater that helps them heal from the killing they've participated in. Or in Rwanda, 30 years after the genocide, the healing is still so difficult, and their investment as a country is in theater, because it's the way engaging children, engaging communities, that they find ways to come to conflict resolution. So that's where I hope that we think about, have we lost our imagination for a properly functioning democracy? And have we lost our imagination for the theater's central role in that?
Wow, thank you, Barbara. Malkia?
Good evening, everyone. Malkia Stampley, and I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, born and raised. And I live in Chicago. Currently, I'm the artistic producer at the Goodman Theater, and I've been there for 3 years. And prior to that, I've lived in New York, but most of my career and my upbringing was in Wisconsin, and I like to say that I'm a product of Wisconsin theater. My head is full with a lot of ideas and questions. My role is producer, but I'm also a director, but came into theater by way of acting, because that's where I saw people who looked like me. And growing up in Wisconsin, I did not see any people of color who were leading any arts initiatives. And I would argue it is still very few. You can count on one hand and maybe take away a few digits who are leading any arts initiatives in the entire state. And that proposed a challenge to me when I kept complaining about it. As I went away for internships and working and then moved back home, and a friend asked me, and I heard a student ask Oskar earlier, what can I do? What can we do? And that it pierced my heart, and it still pierces my soul. And out of that came Bronzeville Arts Ensemble. I co-founded with some colleagues and in the Milwaukee Black Theater Festival. And I began to see myself a part of the solution and not just the ability to name the problem. And that, fortunately, and sometimes I feel unfortunately, I felt moved me out of Wisconsin because I did not feel that there was a place for me here to raise my family while practicing theater. And it still breaks my heart, and sometimes I don't realize how triggered I am about it until I come back and practice theater in Wisconsin. And so, Oskar, all the things that you were saying, I also resonate with many of them. And some of the things that come up for me is the practice or the discipline of theater. And what is that for someone who feels very mission-driven, who in some ways is I'm repelled sometimes, I feel, by the commercialization of theater. Being at a large regional theater, I get to see, I'm working on both sides, often with commercial producers, and I feel conflicted. And so I go, where is my integrity? And what are my non-negotiables as an artist and as an arts leader? And I feel that I'm asking that question to my mentors, to other leaders, legends in the field, our living legends, who are faced with these difficult decisions of art and commerce. And how do we keep the doors open? And how are we serving the people on the edges, on the margins? And I've believed that I was, and also so many thoughts in my head. Before I'll wrap this up, my dad's a preacher, so I got it bad. Something else that that comes to mind is then also this the feeling of belonging and wanting to be a part. And I hear about, pre-pandemic, the good old days of subscriptions, the good old days of sold out houses and funders and state dollars, and I hear about it, and I go, that was a really bad time for me because there was no place for me, and it took a pandemic for me to be even looked at as a possibility to be in my position that I'm in now, because the theater wanted to shake it up and do something different. And after that's all said and done, and I have my lovely journey in all of it, it's hard not to then think back to, but we're missing the old days. And I wasn't there. So I feel like there's a fight to get back there. And who's leading those initiatives, and who are they trying to take along with them? And then move to the side, because we've kind of had enough. That's a difficult place to be in as an arts leader. I'm not going anywhere. That's not happening, because I made that decision a long time ago. But I wrestle with it because I do want to belong. And I don't want to be the only one. I don't want to be the highest ranking Black woman in my theater and in my city. I don't want that in the great city of Chicago. We deserve more than that. So that's what's top of mind for me. How can I ensure that there's an industry for anyone who feels like they connect to how I look, my age, me being a mother of multiple children? If you feel like you resonate with me, how can I make sure that there's room for you when you decide to join it? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that story, Melkia. Jacob, care to weigh in?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Jacob Jansen. I'm the artistic director of Third Avenue Playworks in Sturgeon Bay, which is just up the road. We are a small professional theater operating in Door County. And I just got to say, Melkia is a very exciting person because she is marching us into the future. And that is a future that I want to exist in. Is in a different way. Like, my experience of coming to the arts was, I grew up in a small town called Kiel. You have probably driven past it on the highway, but you've never stopped there. There's a reason. There's nothing there. The closest professional theater was 70 miles away. 70. Couldn't walk there, and when I was, under the age of driving, I couldn't drive there. So then that meant that theater was not for me. But we all know that theater is for everyone, no matter who you are or where you live or where you are from. And because we are all human, we have the capacity to make things, right? We are all artists. That is the thing that makes humans humans, right? And what I get excited about when Melkia talks about, like, how do we go into the future, what I get excited about is that little kid that was me who was, like, feeling like a weirdo, because in my hometown, in my hometown, you had to be related to everybody, and I wasn't related to everybody, so that made me the weirdo. But like you said to the students, right, I was emotional. I was loud. I was dramatic. I was an outsider. But in the theater, I was allowed to be an insider. I was allowed to be creative. And in these small towns and in these spaces where it is so easy to become marginalized, I think there's, sometimes in the theater, we don't do a great job of welcoming everybody in. We're doing a better job of it now. Better, not great. Because I can tell you, in my small town, right, Sturgeon Bay is 9,000 people. It is an unbelievable rarity to have a professional producing organization in a community of that size. Now, there are reasons that we exist, but I think what's exciting and important about that is that we are able to serve that community in a profound way. When we produce a play, like, a third of our community shows up. We changed our tagline for the organization to theater worth talking about, because that's what happens in our community. When we do a show, we just did this really wonderful play called No Wake by Erica Berman, who's a Wisconsin-based writer, that's about aging and age discrimination and class, right? And loss. When we did that play, we had like a third of the people in our community at our theater over the course of the run. The conversations that came out of that, right, the level of penetration into the community is kind of unbelievable. And I've had the opportunity to work at great theaters like the Goodman, where you are, and Studio Theater in Washington, D.C., but even at their best, they weren't serving a third of their community. Now, you serve a hell of a lot more than I do, and of course, but I still think that there's something about having that dialogue. And if you talk about dialogue as the central kind of genius of the theater, then I want, to quote Mao, 1,000 theaters to bloom, right? To be absolutely everywhere. How can we make art happen everywhere? And how can we put those tools, like Lear de Bessonet did with your, the public works, in everybody's hands? Because you can do it, everybody can do it, and you can do it anywhere. So I want to go to that future with you, because I think it's a really beautiful place.
Let's do it. Let's go.
Let's go!
Thank you, Jacob. All right, George.
So I'm George Sugros. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Arts Board, and my degree is in theater. And I believe that I'm here because I'm the ancient Greek. So I wanted to say a few things in reflection of Oskar's talk. first of all, you've come to a place, and you may know this already, you may not. Wisconsin is a place where the Wisconsin idea lives. And Robert Gard, who is somebody that the Arts Board derives its vision statement from, wrote a book called Grassroots Theater, and was all about what you talk about in the sense of it wasn't about professionals going to communities to bring things, though I have to say the Luntz did that, and they thought that was a very important part of their work, and they were too in Wisconsin. But Gard was all about the people learning to communicate with one another through writing scripts, through writing poetry, etc. And so what they used to do is get in their cars and drive across the state and help draw that out of people. And they did pageants. He did a great pageant, I think it was for the 100th anniversary of the state, where all the religions in Madison came together and did this pageant so they could understand one another. So the roots and the soil here is fertile for the conversation that you're having. The second piece I wanted to really articulate with you is just that notion of belonging and loneliness. Last January, the Arts Board was invited to an event in DC with the National Endowment for the Arts, where the Surgeon General spoke about the loneliness epidemic. And he said, you know, the devices, that's part of it, right? We're all looking at our phones and whatever. But, he said, with COVID, we got lured home, and we're having a hard time getting people back out. And so we need the arts, we need the theater to bring people out, because they're not just not going to the arts, they're not going to their houses of worship, and they're not going to community events. And if that's the case, our communities are going to struggle, and they're going to have a really hard time. So that's the second thing. So it's grassroots in Wisconsin, it's the loneliness epidemic, and then finally, and the biggest concern that we face, and Alan has been a part of this conversation, as has Jacob, as has Barbara, it's the education of the youth in theater. Because whether it's K-12 or university theater, there is this thought that this is a frivolous thing we're trying to teach these kids. And partially it's because, and the stereotype is, why would you go into that? There are no jobs. And then if you talk to the people in the theater and you get past the director and the actors, there are plenty of jobs. You just haven't taught anybody about them. So that's a piece of this. And as we look towards the future that we all want to have, first of all, we want everybody in those jobs. But those of us in the professional arts have to get down and into, you know, how low? Do we got to get to kindergarten? Maybe it's not kindergarten. Maybe it's middle school. But we got to get somewhere down there and say, this is a thriving business that you can be part of. And whether you ultimately end up in the theater directly, or like me as an arts administrator, or God forbid as a person who is out there trying to lead the Chamber of Commerce or something like that, your understanding, your knowledge of theater, and to your point, your ability to have dialogue is enhanced by the fact that you learn these things. And so those are the three pieces that, as I reflect on what you were talking about, I wanted to bring forward.
A lot there to take in, and Oskar, I'd love to hear your response to any of this, and then just, you know, let it flow, folks.
Just a couple of quick things. It's wonderful hearing everybody. Grassroots Theater is a really, really important book. It's, you know, one of the foundational texts of the American theater, and I'm well aware of it, and Robert's work in the Wisconsin idea is important far beyond just Wisconsin. And of course, the Federal Theater Project is this brief, shining moment in American history. It lasted for 4 years, and the House Un-American Activities Committee shut it down, and our Shakespeare scholar in residence, James Shapiro, has just written an amazing book about it called The Playbook, which is really worth reading, because his thesis is that was actually the first time that the culture wars were fully engaged in, and that what the radical right learned in that, they have since replicated many many times and used as a way of using culture as a way to divide the American
And
people.
create the deep fissures that now we need to find a way to use theater to mend.
Exactly correct. Exactly right. And it's also, it's very exciting just to hear from both of you guys. And the point you made about the good old days that you had no place in is incredibly important to remember. And it's what, I was talking about this afternoon, I was saying that my job right now, to a certain extent, is to make sure that the gains that we've made in the last few years aren't swept away by the backlash that's coming from, everywhere. This is a very rocky time, and we did make some spectacular gains in the last few years, and we've got to make sure that those gains are cemented in going forward and that they're structurally cemented in. They're not just cemented in on the backs of a few people, but it's why one of the things that matters most to me at the public is that the cultural transformation we've done goes up and down the board, and from the newest board members to the board leadership, it goes up and down the staff. The values have to be built into the institution all the way through, so they're not easy to eradicate. Nothing will permanently, keep that from changing, but you just got to make it hard for circumstances to scrub it away. And I'm just so inspired about the idea of a theater in a 9,000 member town. But you're exactly right. The percentage of participation makes an enormous difference, and of course it's a different way of measuring than raw numbers, but it's an equally important and in some ways more important way of measuring. When I first got to New York, I complained to Philippe de Montebello, who at that time was running the Met, about the fact I just felt like I couldn't see anything. There was so much going on. And he said, no. That's the entire point of New York culture. Because you can't see everything, you have to talk about it. And you have to talk to other people about the things that they saw that you didn't. And the conversation is actually what the culture of New York is, not the seeing thing. And I just love that way of thinking about it. It's the talking that actually makes up the culture. It's not just the viewing.
It engenders community. That's right. Right? Like that becomes the most important thing, that the dialogue that you have, like the dialogue on stage, becomes, oh, did you miss that thing? Well, let me tell you about it. And then I had this mentor who taught me this thing called aesthetic calisthenics, where you'd sit down and you go, okay, I saw this movie. So like The Monk and the Gun, right? And I would be like, oh, that was incredible. That makes me think about this movie. Let me tell you about it. And you go down, you make this list, and now you've got this like watch and listen list of stuff that just is mind-blowing. And it just opens you up to like this creative experience that is like transformative. So like the conversation is the thing. And that is like why we have baked that into kind of the DNA of what we're doing now.
This is completely different, but my sister, who lives in southern Minnesota in a town called Lake City, is sadly declining from dementia. But what she wants to do now is to see plays. So for the last year, once a month, I've been going out, and we've been finding community theater productions in southern Minnesota and going to see them together. And it's been wonderful. I just can't tell you how I feel like my sister has given me this enormous gift of going to the Rochester Civic Theater and the Zumbrota Players, and seeing and just getting immersed in this theater world that is so different than mine and yet so completely familiar too, and the joy of that. And it's just got me really, really excited about blurring the distinctions that we've spent so long building up our silos of the different kinds of theater. And just sort of throwing out those distinctions and really trying to bring us together feels very exciting.
It's true. Sarah O'Connor, who used to run the Milwaukee Rep, once told us a story about why the Rep toured. And she talked about a production of a play that talked about a guy who had been a preacher in Norway, but was defrocked. And he had to come to the States. And he comes to the States, and he's in community, and something happens to the community. And so now he's got a moral dilemma. He needs to consider whether he's going to be a priest again or not. And at the point in the story, he falls to his knees and they had toured to a place in Minnesota, which is why I was bringing this story forward. And at the time that the actor fell to his knees, everybody in the audience fell to their knees as well. And she said, that's why we tour.
I want to ask a question. I know that I'm a community member who goes to these plays and love them and love how it builds community, but I know the challenges to theaters today and to, in maybe not in New York City, but certainly here in Wisconsin. And I was just speaking with somebody who was talking about a nonprofit out in LA, and another one with big, heavy-hitting stars and names of people who are wealthy, giving money to creating narratives, looking for new ways to use narratives in media to help us find a way to come together and blah, 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 telling stories. There's nothing quite new in that. They are trying to imagine something in the use of media, but it occurred to me as I was listening, all of this money coming in this direction without it really empowering people to find their way together and build community and learn conflict resolution as you do through theater and the empathy that we need to heal this. How do we help move public policy, because we are so, Wisconsin's dead last, right? 49th. Oh, 49th. 49th of 50 states in per capita funding of the arts, which is a tragedy. It's ongoing.
Embarrassing.
It's embarrassing. It's ongoing, right. So there's public funding for the arts that really needs to be addressed. It's much better in Minnesota. But then there are the notion of charitable giving and how that is not often, it follows trends. It's for women's rights right now, and as it needs to be for women, but it will move into climate change and all of this. But there's this, as we come back to, this essential nature of theater in education, in building community. How do we tell that story to move the money to it from those directions?
We had a brief moment in this country, which was highly problematic in many ways, in the post-war period up through the 60s, where there was something approaching a national consensus about the importance of the nonprofit arts. Now, that consensus was led almost entirely by white people. It was led almost entirely, it was actually started by white women. Nina Vance in Houston, Margot Jones in Dallas, and Zelda Fitzhandler in Washington, D.C. But as it got bigger and more expensive, it was taken over by white men. So there are terrible problems with it in terms of who got to participate in it. But nonetheless, there was a period there with the New Frontier at Kennedy and the Great Society where government, the large foundations, even businesses were reaching sort of a consensus about the importance of the nonprofit arts in the lives of communities. And that was the great period when all of these regional theaters and symphony orchestras were built. That consensus has vanished. It's shocking how far it's gone. So the big institutions are mostly struggling. And all of these different players that I've just mentioned are each pursuing their own drummer. In New York, talk about embarrassing. More money in the last 20 years has been put into building performing arts centers than I suspect in any city at any time in the world. But the performing arts centers have been built by billionaires as part of real estate deals that are their, little show-off things. Little Island by Barry Diller, the Perlman Arts Center by Ron Perlman and Michael Bloomberg downtown, The Shed in Hudson Yards. And so you have literally billions of dollars that have been put into building performing arts centers with no dialogue with any audience that wanted them or wants them, with no dialogue with any artist that was going to use them. And so those billions of dollars have turned into performing arts centers that are now struggling to find audiences, struggling to find artists that want to be. It's just, it's horrifying. If that money had been, if there had been any kind of cultural plan, if there had been any kind of sense of, you know, New York has an idea of what should be, we would be having the greatest renaissance of performing arts. But everybody's, you know, gotten to go off in their own corner, and the billionaires spend the money that they want, the foundations. We need some form, some place where we can talk about national cultural policy and somehow try to pound out a consensus that people can sign on to. And that's part of making a nation too, and not have everybody go off in their own corner, because it won't work.
The challenge, even here, we've had that same experience where buildings are built. But what then happens is you can put a name on a door. People will give money to put their name on the door, but when it comes time to operate them, where do they look? They look back to the Arts Board and other government entities and those kind of funders and say, okay, we're ready for our operating income now. And they never took any consideration in that fact when they were building that space. And now we're supposed to come in after the fact and help support that. And to your point, that's, if there was a plan in place, we might not have built that thing. Or if we had, we might have built it with a different purpose. But this facility is also one of those places where, because this was here, the community down the road, a certain number of miles, decided they had to have one as well. Why? Because this one existed. And so the Oedipus complex, the edifice complex, said that we need to have one down the road. Not a good enough reason to do it, but it's what happened.
I was fortunate once. I used to work in Washington, D.C., and one of the cool things about Washington, D.C. is it is simultaneously a sleepy southern town and an international city because of all the embassies and, you know, cultural institutions. And I got to do a couple of projects with the German embassy, which was very fun because they fund the arts. So one night I got to have dinner with the German cultural attaché. It was just me and him because we had hit it off and we were having a great time. And I asked him, I was like, so what's the deal with Germany and all your theaters? Because I was meeting young people the same age as me. They were like 26, and they were getting funded to the tune of 200,000 euros a production to do rinky-dink little stuff. Rinky-dink, right, by the scale of German theater. But they had more money than most of these like institutions that my friends were working at who were like scraping it together. I was like, so why do you guys invest in this? And he looked at me like I was an idiot, and he said, Jacob, we are building a nation. We are building a people. If we do not fund the arts, if we do not fund culture in its entire multiplicity, because that was the thing he wanted to talk about, because Germany now is very different than the Germany that was, right? Is that Germany is many Germanesses. That if you don't reflect in the cultural products, those Germanesses will be obliterated by the kind of oppressive nature of the rapacious capital cultural machine. And he was pointing directly at Marvel movies going like, look, if we don't stand up against that, all we're gonna have is Marvel movies until the end of time, and then what will there be of our culture? Now, theater in Germany goes way back. I was very fortunate at that same time, in the same period, to work at Shakespeare Theater, and their dramaturg there is this really wonderful person, Drew Lichtenberg, who is a scholar of German theater. And he told me, in the 18th century in Germany, a town was not a town unless it had a church, a castle, and a theater. You couldn't be a town without all three of those things. Now, in Wisconsin, you cannot be a town without a church and a bar.
A neighborhood.
Often
not-
a bowling alley.
Yeah, in a bowling alley, yeah, in a bowling alley, right? But I think there's something like interesting and instructive in that, right? That we are creating culture. It is a process of creation, and it requires a continuous investment, a continuous kind of engagement. And if you don't engage, it will recede, and then you'll get robot movies.
And that, I think, it makes me think about, Oscar, you mentioned the Obama era, and what his campaign taught all of us was that every little dollar counts. And there's money out there. And if it's fine, not with the Joyce Foundation, and it's fine, not the Wisconsin Arts Board doesn't have enough, then how do we empower our young professionals who are getting these amazing jobs at Amazon and wherever else, who have a little bit of disposable income, or who can give even $20 a month? How do we make them know that it's important? I was at the Goodman doing a drinks and discussion, we call it, for a play that I directed a week ago, and these young Black women were there, and they were lovely, like very, very young, I think just out of school. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe they got a discount, and here I am just judging them all the way, but just so impressed, and they said, no, we have a subscription to the Goodman. And I said, what? She was like, because the Goodman had a deal for $20 a show, and then it was half off on this one particular day, and so we snatched that up, and it was 6 of them. And I asked, what each of them did. Medicine, one of them worked for a super PAC, and another was in tech, and I go, you're all at the beginning of your careers, and you will make a whole lot more money in 10 years or in 5 years, and you're choosing the Goodman? And I go, yes, it's a level of excellence, but it was accessible. And so I go, you know what, if you really want to be involved, how about being a part of our scene board, or, oh man, I'm forgetting, there's a special board, a donor group that we have for those who are 35 and younger, where the price point is a lot lower, and you get a lot of the access that those who are donating $25,000 a year are getting. And so how do we engage and hold on to them? Because they are the ones who we need to be listening to. And it's those conversations I'm interested in. Yeah, come on, if Oscar can't convince the Mellon Foundation to give money, I don't know if I can. But I can talk to 130-year-olds who are making $65,000 a year. And if I can get them to give me $1,000 a year, then I'm on to something. And it's not about selling something necessarily to them. It's saying your dollar matters, and because you chose to be here, how about you help the next person be here too? So we got to do grassroots. We have to think differently, and the ground is ripe for it.
So these giant numbers here they have facing us on the stage are telling me that it's time to take audience questions. So if anybody has either a response to something they've heard up here or a question that they would like to ask, we would love to hear from you. And I don't know how technically this is supposed to work, but we've got microphones coming. Great. So we have a hand here, and we have a hand here. So let's go ahead right here.
Just to follow up on the last.
Yep, you're good.
Just to follow up on the last speaker. I don't know how many people are in here, but between now and Christmas, if each one of us took a friend to a theatrical performance, that would be us making an impact. And I totally support everything you said. I totally agree with everything. I personally am a big advocate of theater. The reality is that change needs to occur not only top down, but bottom up. So Thursday night, November 7th, the Sadov Theater in Fond du Lac has a 3-night run of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The tickets are $15. I live in Sheboygan. 6 of us are going to get in my car and drive over Thursday night and watch that play. At some level, it's not rocket science. It just takes the commitment for each of us.
Thank you for that. We get the microphone down here? Or, okay, we've got one over there.
Hi, George made a really good point about the competing Broadway theater just down the road here. We're not the only pair in the country that's like that. St. Pete and Tampa are the same way. And I find it a bit ironic with us being 49th in state support. The Broadway Theater in Appleton has the #1 subscription renewal rate of all of the Broadway theaters in the United States. And the reason for that is when our children are born, we put them on the season ticket list for the Green Bay Packers. Our culture is you get on the list when you're young. We need to do that with kids for theater too.
Okay, I think we've got another one right down front here.
Hi there. Firstly, I'd like to thank you guys for coming here. This is really cool. I'm a senior getting ready to graduate, hopefully at some point, but I love theater and some cool stuff. I hope. We'll see. One of the things I wanted to sort of throw out there to everyone was the class issue. I know you mentioned it before, and you mentioned it before, quoting Mao. Thank you, by the way. I was going to see if you were going to quote Lenin next. It would have been really fun, but that's beside the point. I personally believe that uniting the working class against the capitalist bourgeoisie influence is super important. In the discussion about how Hollywood is creating these influences on our society, and that just everyday theater isn't done enough. And I very much appreciate, because I never drew the connection between democracy and theater, but now that you pointed out, it's super obvious to me. So I want to throw that question out, though. What do you think in creating a class approach in theater of uniting the working class? And just for context, I'm part of the reader series where we are doing agitprop, or agitation propaganda, to hopefully encourage those to join unions and strike and then vote and take back the working class of America. Thank you.
Well, I certainly have drawn great encouragement from the fact that there seems to be a revival of union activism across the country right now and interest in unionism. And anything that encourages that, I'm all in favor of. You know, these days are very different from the legendary days of union organizing for my family, which were the 30s and 20s and 30s, actually. And the working class is so different now in composition. I mean, what the working class, who the working class are, and where they work, and what their relationship to the owning class is so different that I know it requires a really different set of cultural assumptions about how that's going to work. But boy, it's worth looking into, and it's certainly worth trying to raise people's consciousness about the fact that they are workers, absolutely.
Well, I quoted Mao, so I should weigh in. And for your Lenin quote, what is to be done is to get involved in making, theater, right? To Oscar's point, right, that the relationship that the working class has to capital, right, now is very different. It isn't different fundamentally, but the proximity to who your boss is probably very different. I have a very good friend, Justine Medina. She's a union organizer with the Amazon Labor Union. She's on their organizing committee, right? And that initial vote to unionize on Staten Island went off like a bomb. I know Justine because she and I were trying to organize unemployed arts workers in New York City when the pandemic happened. That's how I met her. She's crazy trade unionist, right? But she raised my consciousness to understand better the contradictions that exist inside of our society. But here's the amazing thing that the theater does, is it asks us to stand inside the contradiction and then to take that contradiction with you out into the world where hopefully you can resolve it. And then you can show that contradiction to your friends. And maybe your enemies, who then can become your friends. Because I think it's really important what Oskar was saying, that like, you can't discount anybody. Because no movement is built by disassociating with some segment of the population. We cannot do that. I make theater art in the most purple of purple counties in all of America. They keep writing stories about Door County as the like deciding county, right? Like which way Door County goes, so goes the nation, whatever. But we have to be able to talk to everyone. And if you read your old theory, right, you'll understand that like we all sit inside of this system. The oppressed and the oppressor are both oppressed by the system. The thing we have to wake people up to is like, what is the structure that we sit inside of? And I think theater is uniquely equipped to show us all how we are functional inside of a system like that. So go read like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, go read, you know, your Bawal and your Theater of the Oppressed, and I think you'll find some other tools as to like how you can engage with community building and theatrical practice that will hopefully turn into political praxis.
Are you familiar with the play The City Council?
No.
Now I'm trying to remember what I know about it. But it was a play that, not long ago, in the last few years, that somebody took the script, the translation of a city council meeting, and turned it into a participatory play in a community.
I think that was at Waterwell. They've been staging a lot of the docudrama stuff in New York. It's really, really great.
So I think about the theater organizations like Jacobs, like other ones all across the state, that are so incredibly important to us. In the Northwest corner, I remember meeting people who wanted to participate in a play and they had to drive 50 miles one way for a rehearsal. At unbelievable personal expense to do that kind of thing. And we need to be supportive of them in terms of finding ways to provide material and excitement and have them help us learn. As I think about the people doing in Rwanda, that we take something like the city council or whatever that engages people on the stage through the theater organization. Our wonderful theaters did an amazing thing last year where they had world premiere Wisconsin, and we had world premieres of plays all over, in a big rollout all over Wisconsin. And it was thrilling, and they were wonderful. But we also need to do the kind of creative thing that gets other people on stage and putting this into our adult and children education process, that this is how we work things out, and this is how we rebuild our democracy.
And just to add to what you're saying, because I think like your comment about the monk and the gun is so interesting, because it is in rehearsing the democracy, right? That I think it's important for us to remember that democracy is not simply in voting. Democracy is an act. You have to participate in democracy. Otherwise, democracy will be done to you, right? And so what I think that, you know, the city council or the other works that they were doing, because they were staging the transcripts from immigration hearings and things like that, right? That democracy is multifarious in its quality, and we have to be engaged as a citizen population the way that our friends from the ancient Greeks, right, the Dionysian festivals were engaged in building a populace and a civic culture.
I resemble that remark. But I do want to say that two things. One, the community developers have done this all kinds of times, and where they take people who are on two different sides of an issue and flip it around. and say, now you will be the person that you've been arguing against, and you will be the other. And then all of a sudden, they see the argument in a completely different way. And just to go back to the point of the conversation of this kind of really strong social thought about theater, the beauty of the theater ecosystem is it all fits. So it can be that, and it can be the musical theater down the road and the community theater that does it work, but it fits in this entire ecosystem here in Wisconsin, across the nation, across the world.
Before we move on to our next question, on a practical level, I encourage you to the foundations that we have been talking about, because they are funding grassroots projects like that. You should be looking at those, and you should be pitching these ideas to the larger theaters in your community or within 50 miles, and pitch it. Pitch it. Let them know that that it's a civic engagement opportunity. It's a way to collect narratives and stories from the community. Whatever jargon works, use that so that you can get paid and those people who are participating can get paid. Because we do need it, but as we all know, and what I struggled with was, I cannot then live off my unemployment because this job ended. That's not gonna help me. And now I'm working way too much for the mission and my values and my integrity, and that's unsustainable. So find the capitalistic jargon that will get you the money to do exactly what you're talking about.
I see one more question over there, and then we're going to wrap it up.
No pressure. This is a question specifically for Oskar and Malkia. As the heads of major artistic organizations, and Oskar, you mentioned Public Works, getting out there, 5 super talented professional actors and 200 members of the community. My question for both of you, because I'm sure that Goodman is also doing similar initiatives, at least in my time in Chicago, Goodman Theater was a beacon of reaching out into the community. So my question for you is, when you do these kinds of initiatives, specifically Public Works, are you following up with any of those 200 people to understand the effect of the empowerment that working with a professional organization like Public had on them, and where did they go? What did they do?
Yeah, yes. The whole point of Public Works is we have long-term, longitudinal, mutual relationships with everybody. Most of the people who've been in Public Works, we are still in constant contact with. Most of the people who started with Public Works 12 years ago, I still know, see, every couple of months at least. Over the summer, I see them very often. These are long-term relationships, and with the organizations, even more long-term. And we committed to that at the very beginning, because what was very clear to us is there was absolutely no value in being a cultural organization that would swoop in, do a project, and vanish. And the long-term nature of these commitments is of the essence of what they are. And for example, and I'm sorry if I mention this, I sometimes I'm an old man and I get confused about repeating myself. Have I told you that the one who comes to you will be the, no. But the Fortune Society, which is an organization that helps reintegrate formerly incarcerated people into society, had a gala in which they honored us a couple of years ago, and 10 people, each of whom I'd known for a decade, all of whom were formerly incarcerated, got up and just each of them testified for a minute about the role that Public Works, Fortune Society, and their 12-step programs were the triangle for each of them that had kept them out of jail, kept them off of drugs, and kept them working. And to hear these people testify like that was just overwhelming in the power of it, because it wasn't bullshit. It wasn't like, oh, the theater changed my life. Oh, once I went to the theater, I was changed forever. It was like one thing among several things that was a necessary ingredient for me to keep my life together. It didn't keep my life together. I kept my life together, but it was one of the things that was a pillar of my sobriety and my straightening, and it was incredibly powerful. And that's the point. We had an anthropologist who embedded herself and her students with us for several years. And what she wanted to do was do an assessment of the impact of public works that wasn't about metrics, that wasn't about, and 600 people and they had 400, but the impact that she found, in one of the things that she stressed was that the insistence on excellence on our part was crucial to the success of the whole program, because we demanded that these people work hard, be as good as they could be. And again, we weren't demanding they pretend to be professional actors, but we were demanding that people showed up on time. We were demanding that people carried their weight, and that all of that, the outcomes in terms of people's ability to keep jobs, ability to keep relationships together, ability to, all of them were just off the charts. And we have the data. We know how good this is. The real issue is the scalability of it all. And for Public Works, we had 16 full partners in the United States, other cities and theaters who've taken this up, and most of those were decimated by the COVID epidemic. The National Theatre of Great Britain became a partner. They have a Public Works program, which again has been not eliminated, but severely hurt by the budget cuts in Great Britain. It's everybody's first choice of what to cut, and it hasn't been ours, which I'm incredibly proud of. We have done no cuts to our public-facing programs, but we're still in the mindset that when the budget cuts come, it's the community programs that start going first, and I just hate it. And we have to fight that. That's one of the many fights we have to do. But yeah, we're very serious about follow-through.
The Goodman, we are far behind, I'd say, in that area. We have had a transition in leadership in the last couple of years. My mentor, Susan Booth, and also in our engagement department. So we don't have a program like that. I'd say the equivalent on a smaller scale would be Chicago Shakespeare Theater and their summer program where it's more like 50, 55. And I've been fortunate to direct one of those epic performances, and then they tour it around the city in the parks. The Goodman has some of our engagement efforts, we call it Generations, where we're working with those who are 55 and older, and we have 18 chapters around the city. And it's a writing group, they're performing, they're doing all sorts of things, and so we're pouring deeper in those relationships and reassessing other things. But I want to bring Public Works to the Goodman or the mobile unit. I'm enthralled, not enthralled, I am impressed, and I am in awe of that work. So thank you for mentioning that, but we have some work to do.
All right, and it looks like we are making things happen up here. So we have reached our time, and I want to thank you all so much on behalf of the Widener Center, on behalf of the Tommy Thompson Institute, on behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. We are so grateful to all of you for being here and helping make this conversation happen. I'm so grateful to the phenomenal panel and to our honored guest, Oskar Eustis. Thank you all.